Welcome to episode 324 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Joining me in a moment is Roel Gevaers, Professor in Last Mile Logistics and Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. We're going to talk about new legislation that's just come into force in Belgium that directly impacts on the last mile. Joining me on the line is Roel Gevaers, Professor in Last Mile Logistics and Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. Roel, welcome back. Earlier this year, we were talking about some changes happening in Belgium relating to the last mile. There was talk about legislation that might do things like crystallize the definition of an employee or a self-employed driver and all those sorts of things. Well, there's been a big announcement in November, which is something called Bell Parcel. So, Roel, tell us, what on earth is Bell Parcel?
Well, Bell Parcel has been launched. It's now the website that was launched by the Belgian government, where parcel companies can check news and updates about the new approved parcel legislation in Belgium. This law, where we spoke earlier about, was approved on the 9th of November, so around 2 weeks ago from now, or some weeks ago. And the interesting thing there is that website describes if you as a company are subject to that law or not, and what are the main important things that you should know about that law. Well, first of all, it describes when and how you are considered as a parcel player in Belgium. And so they describe, for example, it's as long as you deliver parcels to a Belgian address from a distribution center in Belgium or abroad, and the parcel is below 31.5 kilo, you're part of the law, let's say it that way. Next to that, there are some descriptions when you are also, if you are working exclusively for companies, yes or no, which is a bit vague, to be honest. And there is also a description that you need to, the number of hours you are maximum allowed to work, that you need to have a coordinator within the company who is responsible for all the data gathering related to the number of working hours. There is a description related with another law which was published, how many euros per hour that needs to be paid, a minimal wage, let's say it that way, etc., etc. So Bell Parcel is, let's say, the website or the bigger name of the law with all its, let's say, not all the details, but the description of what should be in and what you should take into account as a parcel courier.
Now, I'm sure that people who are listening to this, their heads are spinning,
yeah.
saying, what on earth is all this about? Now, you can go to the website. If you're listening to this and you have access to a website, you can go to bellparcel.be and you'll see a bit about what Roel's on about here. But tell us, what is the idea of this legislation? What are its intended outcomes? So maybe we should talk about that before we talk about
absolutely.
what it's going to mean in a day-to-day sense and who's going to be caught up in it. What is the intention of this legislation?
Well, around 2 years ago now, also around the period of Black Friday in 2021, there was some news in Belgium. Journalist from DPG Media went undercover in a parcel courier company, and he showed that there were in last mile parcel delivery services in Belgium. But of course, it's something that you have that in more than one country. It's also in some other European countries the case that sometimes some parcel couriers are not earning always a lot of money, or that there is a problem with social security. The reason why that was is due to the fact that, as always in Belgium, the parcel industry always was a bit, let's say, left behind, not a lot of social controls. So everybody knew that if you are cheating, the chance that you would have a fine was rather limited. He showed that there were some issues, and the reaction from the cabinet minister De Sutter was instead of trying to increase the checks, it's a bit like if you drive too fast, people will only drive slower if you checks and speed checks. Instead, she implemented a new law, a new parcel law, now approved the 9th of November. But the issue with this law is that it's very complex and that it does not plan to increase the checks from Social Security. It's just a new law which is very, very complex. And the aim of the law, to be honest, let's call what the main aim is that the law, the new postal law, will try to push as much as possible subcontractors, although they are a subcontractor, but the law is pushing them in a way that they are almost considered as employees, because they will have a minimum wage per hour, while normally that's not allowed with a subcontractor, because then you speak about false self-employment, etc., etc. So it's a new law only applied for parcels. The idea was to reduce the number of social fraud issues, while mainly unions, transportation sectors, and many experts had the opinion like they should have increased the social checks and the penalties, etc., with the existing laws instead of creating a very complex law, which is now the case.
Now, you mentioned a couple of things earlier on that we might just delve into a little bit further. One was that it's about the last mile and for items weighing less than 31.5 kilograms. Now, the definition of last mile sort of means that returns aren't part of it. Is that right? Is that what you said earlier?
Yeah, so in the law applies, and it's a funny thing to refer to. Is I will read it like it's really literally stated there. The law only targets the parcel delivery phase known as the last mile. The phase covers the preparation of the tour to the delivery of the parcels to the specified address in Belgium. So the interesting thing there is that it means as well that if you have a courier who does both deliveries and returns and pickups, the pickup and the return formally is not part of the legislation like it is described here. So formally for the returns and for the pickups, they don't need to do the time registration, but as from the moment you do a delivery, you need to do the time registration.
And the other thing you mentioned was about it applies to Belgian-based carriers, so bpost, I imagine, is the number one there. Mm-hmm. Any other company that's based in Belgium, but also international companies that deliver in Belgium. Now, is that really code for companies that might have their warehouse or the distribution centre on the Netherlands side of the border and then they deliver into Belgium? Are they going to be caught up by this?
Yes, they as well. So as from the moment you do a delivery to a Belgian address, it will be considered as part of the law. So even if the distribution center is abroad or over the border, you will be part of this law. And the interesting thing there is that foreign last mile carriers, they need to do at least two things. First of all, they need to register themselves in the Crossroad Bank for Enterprises, which is a kind of list of all formerly Belgian companies, but they need to register in that Crossroad Bank for Enterprises. And next to that, they need to register themselves as well at BIPT, the postal regulator, to be part of this legislation as well. So they need to do two steps. And you need to know that every time of registration, there is a cost related to that. So first, they need to pay the Crossroad Bank for Enterprises, and secondly, they need to pay for registration at BIPT register.
So new legislation means new bureaucracy, effectively.
Yes.
More red tape for carriers. Now, everybody listening to this will be immediately thinking, well, more red tape or more compliance, however you want to term it, will eventually or could eventually translate into more cost. And we operate in a very competitive environment when it comes to delivery of parcels, and margins are often wafer thin. So when we talk about the outcomes of this, I suppose you mentioned earlier that the legislative outcomes are supposed to be things like better protection of drivers, better availability of social security protections and things like that. But the unintended outcome, or maybe intended, who knows, will be that of cost. What's your take on that? Where do you see the cost really making an impact in the last mile sector?
The interesting thing is that as I said earlier, that there will be, like you say, a huge impact on the administrative side, and there will be more administrative cost related to that. For example, the law also stipulates that every company needs to have a coordinator, a parcel coordinator, coordinator who needs to write out a full plan for every company that is related to this legislation. They need to have a kind of a plan how they deal with issues in the parcel and postal sector, how to deal with too low wages, how they will make sure that they can do the all-time registration. And then that coordinator is also responsible within the company for making sure that every 6 months, it will be every 6 months, it's decided now, that all that data with the number of driven hours, the number of delivered parcels, etc., need to be sent into the BIPT regulator, and there they need to do then certain checks on it to check if everything is in line with the maximum hour lead times per day, per week, per month, etc., But of course, especially for the smaller subcontractor companies, there will be potentially a huge administrative burden. Because I know some experts, or let's say the cabinet is saying yes, but all those companies have rather easy parcel delivery schemes, and you get today an expected time of arrival with a parcel. So it's not that difficult to have all the timings, but we all know that in many cases that are totally different. The invoicing systems are completely different sometimes than the routing systems, which makes that it will be an administrative burden potentially to get all that data and send it in every 6 months. Yes, and then the question is also, will it be in Excel? Will it be all that kind of things? Might
Right.
be a complex thing. Yes.
Now, tell us about the costs in the last mile as well. So, if the impact is that there'll be more, well, we were talking about the hourly rate or the effective hourly rate and all those sorts of things. What would that mean for, say, metro delivery versus rural delivery, and the costs per drop or the cost per hour in the last mile? Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing there is that today, especially in Belgium, all the parcel operators, they operate in a system where they give national parcel delivery prices. So whether you deliver in a city as Antwerp or Brussels, or you deliver more in a rural area, overall, most of these prices are fixed prices for the whole of Belgium in most cases. Now, this law with a minimum wage, and it's now decided for this month, it's decided that it will be 32.77 euro. It can change related to fuel, etc., but that's now the starting amount. The interesting thing there is, of course, if you can only deliver 5 to 6 parcels in the rural areas, and you calculate that with per hour, and you calculate that referring to the minimum wage hours, it means that the parcels mainly in the rural areas will become expensive to very expensive, and it might even push postal operators to systems where you say, I need to ask an extra premium to the web shops for operating or for doing deliveries in rural areas. Because in cities, you still have decent drop sizes, and there the impact might be a bit less, except from the administrative burden, of course. But on the rural areas, you might see a huge impact on costs related to last mile delivery.
What about out-of-home delivery? I know there was some talk earlier about parcel lockers being compelled to be carrier neutral in Belgium. Is that right? Is this part of this, or is that separate? And first of all,
it's a law which was decided, or a proposal which was decided by the same cabinet and minister, but it's not part of this legislation. But the interesting thing where you refer to is an interesting thing indeed, because if you read the website Bel Parcel, and you check there and you see, for example, your company is subject to the new law. It states from a distribution center in Belgium to a Belgian address. That's already, let's say, and of course it's a website. This is not the exact copy of the law, but this is a website where everybody will base themselves if you need to apply yes or no. The interesting thing is already then you start the discussion, is a parcel locker a Belgian address, yes or no? So, but this is all part of let's say the multiple laws that were implemented by Cabinet de Sutter for dealing with postal parcel legislation. But it's not the same; it's another law.
Now, the interesting thing for me about all of this is that we're looking at legislation that will impact not just within Belgium's borders effectively. If you're an international company operating outside the borders, not operating, what's the word? You're based outside the Belgian border, but you are operating within it, you'll be caught up in this. what is it that's driven the interest of Minister de Sutter in this case? She's really has taken a lot of interest in the delivery world, more so it appears than her equivalents in other countries. I mean, apart from the negative headlines that you mentioned from a couple of years ago, is there something else that's sort of driving the narrative inside of Belgium when it comes to the last mile?
The problem is a bit is that 2 years ago, when the whole postal or parcel mainly issue with the issue that came up with an undercover television program, is that as from that moment politics started moving. But the problem is that last year the whole legislation became a bit more a dogmatic discussion between pro and contra, and it was clearly that you need to know that next year in Belgium, June 2024, it are elections for the federal and Flemish government. And let's say if a minister wants to push something through, it's a bit now the period to push it through, because we all know in Belgium, as from January, not a lot of things are moving anymore in legislation-wise. So the what is overall considered, or what is overall considered both with many experts, Transportation Federation, but also unions, etc., is that the implementation of this law became at a certain moment a bit more a dogmatic discussion, as we need to implement a law to show that we are the first in Europe that can do this, and not always looking to the potential impacts of it and the complexity of it. And that's also what you see now. I presented some weeks ago I was invited at a conference about flows and parcel economics in Europe. And of course, there is a big fear that if every European country starts doing things like this, it becomes one big mess within a so-called European Union with open e-commerce borders, I mean, if you look only to Belgium, we are closely related with Germany, France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. If every of these countries start making this kind of laws with this level of complexity, where you need to register in every country as a local operating country, then you cannot speak anymore about free trade of goods and people within the European Union, of course, which is a bit strange, to be honest, today in the economy.
And there's also a big company whose name begins with A that does operate freely across borders within Europe. And so Amazon might be taking a very close interest in this. And it's probably not coincidence that over the last few years, Amazon has been really boosting its numbers of political lobbyists in Europe, since there's such an interest in this. I mean, it's different in every country, isn't it, Roel? I mean, you look at what's happened in France with the booksellers and the transport of books, and you look at what's happened in places like Barcelona. Anyway, let's not try and make a big soup out of this.
No, indeed.
But but I think it's an interesting point about, is it going to be the case where Belgium leads, the rest of Europe will follow? The question of classification of delivery drivers continues to be a live one in many countries, and even outside of Europe. Roel, if people want to find out more about your work, or you and the rest of the team at the University of Antwerp, where should they go?
Well, they can check, of course, the website of the University of Antwerp, where I have my own page where you can find with lectures I'm giving. And of course, I'm a user of LinkedIn. So if people are interested, they can always link up. So that are the two main channels, let's say.
I'll put a link to Roel's LinkedIn profile and to his university webpage on the episode page on thepostalhub.com. So go on over to thepostalhub.com and find this episode page if you're not already on it, and you'll find the way to connect with Roel Gevaers, Professor in Last Mile Logistics and Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. Thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
With pleasure.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, our friends from Copenhagen Economics return to talk about the USO. Some very interesting developments happening in Europe. And we'll also be joined later in the year by a cavalcade of stars for my almost traditional end-of-year wrap episodes. Who's coming along? We've got, I can tell you some of them. We've got Kate Muth, we've got Mike Plunkett, we've got Mark Fallon, Dean McCuba, and various other luminaries from the delivery world. So keep an eye out for those episodes. Make sure you don't miss any of them by subscribing. So make sure, that's a terrible sentence, everybody. You know what I mean. Go to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from. You can subscribe to the podcast. And while you're over there, please leave a rating. Only takes a moment. And lets everybody else know just what you think about the Postal Hub podcast. Hopefully good things. Anyway, what else can you do? Relax? No, because it's peak season. Of course you're not relaxing. Subscribe to the podcast. I've said that. Subscribe to our email newsletters at thepostalhub.com. Follow me on LinkedIn. And if you want to email me, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in. And I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.